Difference between cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. What is a cross-sectional study? Cross-sectional study can be undertaken in which data are gathered just once, perhaps over a period of days or weeks or months, in order to answer a research question. Such studies are called one-shot or cross-sectional study. The purpose of the study was to collect data that would be pertinent to finding the answer to a research question. Consider the following example. Data were collected from stockbrokers between April and June of last year to study their concerns in a turbulent stock market. Data with respect to this particular research had not been collected before, nor will they be collected again for this research. Data collection at one point in time was sufficient. This is cross-sectional design. Second example is drug company wanting to invest in research for a new obesity reduction pill conducted a survey among obese people to see how many of them would be interested in trying the new pill. This is a one-shot or cross-sectional study to assess the likely demand for the new product. What is a longitudinal study? Longitudinal study is a study in which the researcher studies people or phenomena at more than one point in time in order to answer the research question. Data on the dependent variable are gathered at two or more points in time to answer the research question. It helps to identify cause and effect relationship. Longitudinal studies take more time, efforts, and cost more than cross-sectional studies. Here, because data are gathered at 2 points in time, the study is not cross-sectional or one-shot, but is carried longitudinally across a period of time. For instance, the researcher might want to study employees' behavior before and after a change in the top management, so as to know what effects the change accomplished. Other example is, a marketing manager is interested in tracing the pattern of sales of a particular product in 4 different regions of the country on a quarterly basis for the next 2 years. Since data will be collected several times to answer the same issue, tracing pattern of sales, the study falls into the longitudinal category. Difference between cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. Cross-sectional studies are carried out in one specific point of time. On the other hand, longitudinal studies are carried out over the period of time. Cross-sectional studies provide a snapshot of the situation. On the other hand, longitudinal studies provide a long-term analysis of the situation. In cross-sectional study, participants are needed only once for the study purpose. On the other hand, in longitudinal study, participants are engaged throughout the study. Cross-sectional study is known as descriptive research. On the other hand, longitudinal study is known as causal or relational research. In cross-sectional study, data is collected from different samples at one specific point of time. On the other hand, in longitudinal study, data is collected from the same sample over the period of time. The advantage of cross-sectional design is that it allows researchers to compare different variables, age, sex, gender, income, etc. at single point in time. On the other hand, in longitudinal studies, only one variable is considered to conduct a study over a period of time. Cross-sectional study can provide information about the current status, what is happening at present. On the other hand, longitudinal study can provide information about what is happening in a certain period of time. Cross-sectional study does not provide information and cannot establish cause and effect relationship. On the other hand, longitudinal study can establish and justify cause and effect relationship. In cross-sectional study, researchers are not able to detect developments or changes in the characteristics of the target population. Whereas in longitudinal studies, researchers are able to detect developments or changes in the characteristics of the target population at both the group and the individual level. Cross-sectional study takes relatively shorter time than the longitudinal studies. On the other hand, longitudinal study take longer time compared to cross-sectional studies. Economically, cross-sectional studies are cheaper and cost-effective compared to longitudinal studies, whereas longitudinal studies are expensive compared to cross-sectional studies. Findings from cross-sectional studies aren't enough to make conclusive observations about any association or significance between variables, while findings from longitudinal studies could be used to make conclusive results or associations between variables. Cross-sectional research. Definition, example, pros and cons of using cross-sectional research. Definition of cross-sectional research. Cross-sectional research is defined as a type of research design in which you collect data from different individuals at a single point in time. In cross-sectional research, you observe variables without influencing them. In cross-sectional research, data is collected at one point in time. Example of cross-sectional research. Researchers studying development psychology might select groups of people who are different ages but investigate them at one point in time. By doing this, any differences between the age groups can presumably be attributed to age differences rather than something that happened over time. Types of cross-sectional research. Cross-sectional studies can be used for both analytical research and descriptive research. An analytical research tries to answer how or why a certain outcome might occur. A descriptive research only summarizes said outcome using descriptive statistics. Advantages of cross-sectional research. Relatively quick to conduct. Researchers can collect all variables at one time. Multiple outcomes can be researched at once. Prevalence for all factors can be measured. Suitable for descriptive analysis. Researchers can use it as a springboard for further research. Disadvantages of cross-sectional research. It is difficult to establish cause and effect relationship using cross-sectional studies since they only represent a one-time measurement of both the alleged cause and effect. To investigate cause and effect, you need to do a longitudinal study or an experimental study. Since cross-sectional studies only study a single point in time, they cannot be used to analyze behavior over a period of time or establish long-term trends. Report biases. Surveys or questionnaires about certain aspects of people's lives may not always result in accurate reporting, and there is usually not a mechanism for verifying this information. Longitudinal studies. Definition, types, pros and cons, and the method to perform a longitudinal study. What is longitudinal study? A longitudinal study is a research conducted over an extended period of time. It is a type of correlation research in which researchers observe and collect data on a number of variables without trying to influence those variables. It is mostly used in medical research and other areas like psychology or sociology. Types of longitudinal studies. There are three types of longitudinal studies: panel study, cohort study, and retrospective study. Let's study them in detail. Definition of panel study. In panel study, the researcher collects data from the same sample at different points in time. These studies measure people's behavior over time, especially their opinions, feelings, emotions, and thoughts. Definition of cohort study. A cohort study is a type of longitudinal study that samples a group of people who share a common characteristic. Researchers observe a population based on the shared experience of a specific event such as birth, geographic location, or historical experience. These studies are typically used among medical researchers. Definition of retrospective study. A retrospective study uses already existing data collecting during previously conducted research with similar methodology and variables. While doing a retrospective study, the researchers uses an administrative database, pre-existing medical records, or one-to-one interviews to gain insights about a population. How to perform a longitudinal study? If you want to implement a longitudinal study, you have two choices. 1. Collecting your own data. 2. Using data from other sources. Collecting your own data. If you choose to collect your own data, the way you go about it will be determined by the type of longitudinal study you choose to perform. You can choose to conduct a retrospective or a prospective study. In a retrospective study, you collect data on events that have already happened. In a prospective study, you choose a group of subjects and follow them over time, collecting data in real time. Using data from other sources. Many governments or research centers carry out longitudinal studies and make the data freely available to the general public. For example, anyone can access data from the 1970 British Cohort study, which has followed the lives of 17,000 Brits since their birth, in a single week in 1970 through the UK Data Service website. These statistics are generally very trustworthy and allow you to investigate changes over a longer period of time. Pros of using longitudinal study. Longitudinal study is a long-term study. Its authenticity is verified in advance, which makes the result have a high level of validity. Allow identifying trends. Whether in medicine, psychology, or sociology, the long-term design of a longitudinal study enables trends and relationships to be found within the data collected in real time. The previous data can be applied to know future results and have great discoveries. Flexibility. Because this is a long-term study, the researchers have a flexibility that is not possible with other research formats. Cons of using longitudinal study. Costly and time-consuming. Longitudinal studies can take months or years to complete, rendering them expensive and time-consuming. Because of this, the researchers tend to have difficulty recruiting participants, leading to smaller sample sizes. Large sample size needed. Longitudinal studies tend to be challenging to conduct because large samples are needed for any relationship or patterns to be meaningful. Researchers are unable to generate results if there is not enough data. Participants tend to drop out. Not only is it a struggle to recruit participants, but subjects also tend to leave or drop out of the study due to a variety of reasons, such as illness, relocation, or a lack of motivation to complete the full study. This tendency is known as selective attribution and can threaten the validity of an experiment.